Emily was just 12 years old when she and her loyal German shepherd Bruno went for a walk in the snowy woods of Whispering Pines. But instead of an ordinary stroll, Bruno's urgent barking led her to a terrifying sight: a police car crushed at the bottom of a ridge, and inside, Officer Ryan Miller lay unconscious, his life slipping away in the freezing night. Emily had no idea this discovery would uncover a crime so dark that it nearly cost Ryan his life. Yet it was also the beginning of a bond that would turn an ordinary dog into a true town hero. What happened next will make you cry and believe in miracles again. Before we start, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The late afternoon in Whispering Pines carried the hush of early winter. The small mountain town, tucked between ridges of evergreen pines, seemed to hold its breath as thin snowflakes spiraled down from a slate-gray sky. The air smelled faintly of pine sap and wood smoke drifting from scattered chimneys. It was the kind of quiet that made every crunch of boots on frozen ground sound louder, every bark echo longer through the trees. Emily Carter pulled her scarf tighter around her neck as she stepped off the cracked sidewalk leading out of town and onto the forest trail. At just 12 years old, she was slight and wiry, with pale skin reddened by the cold and a cascade of brown hair that escaped in wisps from beneath her knitted cap. Her hazel eyes carried a mix of curiosity and loneliness, an expression that had followed her since moving to Whispering Pines 3 months ago. The move, forced by her father's job change, had left Emily friendless in a new town where the children at school already had their tight-knit circles. She had learned to smile politely and keep quiet, hiding the ache of isolation behind the steady presence of her only constant companion. That companion now trotted ahead, tugging on the leash with determined energy. Bruno was no ordinary pet. He was a German shepherd, 8 years old, his sable coat streaked with silver along his back and muzzle. His left ear bent slightly at the tip, a scar of some unknown injury before he had come to the Carters from a shelter 2 years earlier. His eyes, a deep intelligent brown, held both caution and loyalty, as though he had appointed himself Emily's personal guardian. Bruno was large, close to 90 pounds of muscle and instinct, but with Emily he was gentle, almost paternal. When she read books late into the night, Bruno lay by her bed. When she cried about missing her mother, who had passed away 2 winters ago, Bruno rested his heavy head on her lap until her sobs subsided. He was, in every sense, her anchor. "Come on, Bruno," Emily murmured, though the dog hardly needed encouragement. He walked with purpose, sniffing the frosted earth, tail stiff with focus. Emily sighed. "You always know where you're going, don't you?" The trail bent downward, weaving between pines whose branches creaked under the growing weight of snow. Bruno slowed, his body language shifting. Muscles taut, ears perked, nose twitching. Emily felt the leash pull sharply. "What is it?" she whispered. Bruno's only answer was a low growl in his throat. They pushed deeper into the trees until the forest opened to a steep slope. The road above twisted sharply, its guardrails frosted with ice. Below, in the gully, lay a wreck that made Emily's heart lurch. A police cruiser flipped onto its side, windshield fractured into a web of glass, wheels still spinning weakly. Emily froze, clutching the leash. She had never seen an accident up close before. Steam hissed from the crushed hood, and the metallic tang of gasoline stung her nostrils. Bruno barked furiously, tugging her toward the wreck. Fear fought with instinct inside Emily. She wanted to run home, yet something stronger, perhaps the echo of her late mother's lessons about compassion, urged her forward. "Okay, boy," she whispered, "but just for a look." They scrambled down the embankment. Emily's boots slid on icy soil, and Bruno steadied her with his solid weight pressing close to her legs. As they reached the wreckage, Emily peered inside through the shattered driver's window. A man slumped over the steering wheel. His uniform, navy blue and dusted with shards of glass, identified him unmistakably as a police officer. Blood trickled from a cut on his temple, staining the collar of his shirt. His chest rose shallowly, each breath ragged but present. Emily gasped. "He's alive!" Bruno pressed his snout toward the opening, whining softly. The dog's eyes seemed almost pleading, as if begging Emily to act. She hesitated, trembling with the weight of responsibility far beyond her years. The man inside stirred faintly, though his eyes did not open. His face was young, yet marked by strain, the kind that came from years of duty. Later, Emily would learn his name. Officer Ryan Miller, 32 years old. Ryan had short dark hair matted with blood at the hairline, a square jaw that hinted at stubbornness, and the kind of presence that spoke of discipline even in unconsciousness. Ryan had grown up in Whispering Pines, known for his quiet integrity and a reputation for standing up against corruption in town politics. But in this moment, all Emily saw was a man fighting for life in the cold. She yanked on Bruno's collar. "We need help. I can't do this alone." Bruno responded immediately, as if he understood every word. He turned, bounding back up the slope toward town with a speed Emily had never seen before. The leash slipped from her grasp, whipping through her gloved fingers. She didn't chase him. Instead, she dropped to her knees beside the wreck, fingers trembling as she brushed ice from the officer's sleeve. "You'll be okay," she whispered, though her voice cracked. "Bruno's gone to get Dad. Hold on." Her words vanished into the wind. The snow thickened, falling in frantic spirals, shrouding the forest in a curtain of white. Emily hugged her arms to her chest, praying her father would come quickly, praying that the stranger in uniform would keep breathing until then. And in the stillness, with only the hiss of the broken engine and the distant fading barks of Bruno echoing through the woods, she realized that her life in Whispering Pines was about to change forever. Bruno tore through the snow-laden streets of Whispering Pines, paws hammering the frozen ground with frantic urgency. His breath puffed in clouds against the icy air, his deep bark echoing off shuttered storefronts and sleeping houses. The town at dusk seemed deserted, save for the trail of paw prints he left behind. Every stride carried the urgency of a creature who understood what his human companion could not accomplish alone. He needed help, and he knew exactly where to find it. At the edge of town, a small house sat wedged between two sagging maples, its porch light sputtering like a dying lantern. Inside, Thomas Carter bent over a scarred wooden table, fingers blackened with grease, tightening the bolts of a carburetor. At 42, Thomas carried the broad shoulders of a former Marine, his once square jaw now softened by stubble and years of quiet exhaustion. His dark blonde hair, peppered faintly with gray, clung damply to his forehead from the day's labor. He was a man shaped by discipline and loss, whose stern face masked the tenderness he reserved only for his daughter, Emily. Since the death of his wife, sorrow had dulled the edges of his laughter. The move to Whispering Pines had been an attempt at a new beginning, though loneliness often crept into his evenings like unwelcome fog. The sudden crash against the door jarred him from his work. A low growl, followed by a frantic bark, split the silence. Thomas dropped his wrench, heart thudding. "Bruno?" He yanked open the door, and the German shepherd lunged inside, circling, barking, then darting back out, stopping to look over his shoulder with urgent eyes. The dog's body trembled, his coat flecked with ice. Thomas's brow furrowed. "What is it, boy?" He grabbed his coat from the hook, slipping it over his muscular frame, and stepped into the cold. Bruno barked once more, running a few paces ahead, then stopping. His tail lashed, his eyes locked on Thomas's imploring. Thomas's soldier's instinct stirred. He had seen this kind of urgency in war dogs before, in faraway deserts where seconds meant lives. Without hesitation, he followed. Across the narrow street, curtains twitched. From the shadow of a porch, Mrs. Edna Jenkins peered out. She was a wiry woman in her late 60s, hair tucked beneath a wool cap, her posture stiffened by arthritis and a lifetime of carrying her own burdens. Known in town for her sharp tongue and quicker judgment, she often muttered about that noisy mutt disturbing her peace. Tonight, however, she watched in stunned silence as Bruno darted into the snow, pausing only to ensure Thomas was on his heels. The dog's urgency was undeniable, a far cry from the nuisance she had dismissed. For the first time, doubt pricked her certainty. Perhaps this animal was more than she had allowed herself to believe. Thomas jogged, boots crunching through the frost, his breath fogging. "Emily?" he called into the dark, though the only answer was Bruno's rhythmic barks guiding him along the narrow road, past shuttered shops and into the forest's edge. His heart pounded, every step tightening the coil of dread inside him. His mind flashed to his daughter's face, those earnest hazel eyes, the soft tilt of her smile that reminded him of his late wife. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The trail dipped, and Bruno bounded down the slope, snow spraying behind him. Thomas followed with the balance of a man who had once navigated terrain far less forgiving, but the urgency now came from fear for his child, not orders barked through static radios. He stumbled once, regained his footing, and pressed on. Then, through the pines, he saw her. Emily stood at the edge of the wrecked police cruiser, arms wrapped around herself, her small frame trembling against the wind. The headlights of the car still glowed faintly, painting the snow with a ghostly light. Bruno rushed back to her side, pressing against her legs as if to anchor her. "Daddy!" Emily's voice cracked, relief flooding her features. Thomas slid down the last stretch of slope, landing beside her. His eyes widened as he took in the crushed vehicle, the smell of gasoline, the hiss of steam. His military-trained gaze assessed quickly. Overturned cruiser, one occupant inside, unconscious but alive. His daughter standing far too close to danger. "Emily, step back," he ordered, his voice steady but urgent. He placed himself between her and the wreck, scanning for hazards. Then his eyes fell on the man inside. The officer's uniform was torn, his forehead smeared with blood. His chest rose in shallow, labored breaths. "Officer down," Thomas muttered, instinct rising from memory. He crouched, pressing 2 fingers to the man's neck. A pulse weak, but there. Relief flickered, followed by determination. Emily clutched Bruno's collar, her teeth chattering. "He was like this when we found him. Bruno brought me here." Thomas looked at the dog, whose fur bristled with both cold and tension, then back at his daughter. He felt a swell of pride, tempered by urgency. "You did good, Em. And you too, boy." He ruffled Bruno's head briefly before focusing on the task. Thomas's marine training kicked in. He quickly checked the man's airways, then assessed visible injuries. "Head wound, possible concussion, maybe broken ribs. We can't move him carelessly." His voice dropped, "But it's too cold to wait." Emily bit her lip. "What do we do?" Thomas inhaled, decision settling over him like armor. "We get him to the truck, then straight to the hospital." He met her gaze, softening. "I need you steady, sweetheart. Can you do that?" Emily nodded, though fear shimmered in her eyes. Bruno pressed against her side as if to lend her courage. Together, father and daughter worked quickly. Thomas braced himself, pulling open the shattered door with a grunt. Glass crunched beneath his gloves. The officer groaned faintly, stirring but not waking. "Easy, son," Thomas murmured. He slipped his arms under the man's shoulders, muscles straining as he lifted. Emily held the flashlight steady, her hands trembling but determined. Bruno paced, circling protectively, his growls low whenever the forest groaned with wind. At last, Thomas hauled the officer free of the wreck. Snow swirled around them, biting their faces, but Thomas pressed forward, guiding the limp form up the slope. Emily followed close, Bruno darting ahead to clear their path. Step by step they climbed, the dark pressing in. The weight of the moment carried on all their shoulders. When they reached the road, Thomas gently lowered the man onto the snowbank to catch his breath. His chest heaved, muscles burning, but there was no time to rest. He looked at Emily, then at Bruno, who stood alert, tail stiff, ears twitching. "We've got him out," Thomas said, voice firm. "Now, let's get him to the truck." Emily exhaled shakily, brushing snow from her cheeks. Bruno nudged her hand with his wet nose, and for the first time since finding the wreck, a fragile spark of hope warmed her. Thomas shifted Ryan Miller's weight higher against his chest, muscles taut with strain. The officer's body was heavy and unresponsive, his head lolling against Thomas's shoulder as snow whirled down with merciless persistence. Emily scrambled up the roadside behind them, clutching Bruno's collar to keep her balance as the dog carved a path through the deepening drifts. The road glistened like black glass beneath a skin of ice, and Thomas knew every moment they lingered meant the injured man's chances grew slimmer. The old pickup truck waited on the shoulder, its paint dulled by years of weather, its frame creaking like tired bones whenever the wind howled. Thomas eased Ryan onto the passenger seat, careful not to jostle the man's ribs. The officer groaned faintly, eyelids fluttering before sliding shut again. Thomas checked his pulse, a weak throb, but still there. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Get in the back, Em," Thomas instructed, his tone gruff but gentle. "Keep Bruno with you. Stay warm." Emily obeyed without protest, climbing into the cab and scooting close to Bruno, who leapt up effortlessly beside her. The dog positioned himself half on the seat, half leaning against Ryan, his muzzle resting lightly on the officer's thigh, as though tethering him to life itself. Emily tucked her arms around Bruno's thick fur, her small face buried against his shoulder. Thomas turned the ignition, and the engine coughed before sputtering to life. The headlights cut through the swirling white, beams swallowed quickly by the storm. He shifted into gear and pressed the accelerator, the tires spinning before gripping the slick road. The truck lurched forward, carrying its fragile cargo into the blizzard. The highway stretched ahead, a ribbon of treachery disappearing into snow. Thomas's knuckles whitened around the wheel, eyes narrowed against the blur of flurries. His mind churned with calculation speed, distance, time until Ryan's condition worsened. The hospital was 12 miles away, 12 miles that felt like an ocean. Emily sat silently, though her chest rose in trembling breaths. She thought of her mother, of hospital rooms that smelled of antiseptic and whispered prayers that had gone unanswered. The memory rose unbidden, her mother's thin hand clutching hers, the weight of inevitability pressing on a child too young to comprehend loss. Now, with Ryan lying beside her, pale and broken, Emily feared history would repeat itself. Bruno shifted, sensing her turmoil. He licked her gloved hand, slow and deliberate, his warm breath fogging against the frost clinging to the window. Emily blinked hard, swallowing down the knot in her throat. She clung to the dog as if his heartbeat could anchor her against the rising tide of dread. The truck jolted violently as it hit a patch of ice, fishtailing before Thomas wrestled it straight. Emily gasped, clutching Bruno tighter. "Daddy!" "It's all right," Thomas said, though his voice betrayed the tension threading through him. "Just keep still. We'll make it." For a stretch, silence reigned, broken only by the growl of the engine and the storm's moan. Then, from the dim passenger seat, a faint sound, a groan, hoarse and weak. Thomas darted a glance. Ryan's lips parted, breath rattling. His eyes fluttered, barely opening before rolling back. His hand twitched against the seat. Emily leaned forward quickly. "He's moving! Daddy, he's moving!" Thomas adjusted one hand from the wheel to check Ryan's breathing. "He's fighting. That's good." His jaw clenched. "But we need to get there faster." They passed the outskirts of town, houses huddled like tired sentinels against the storm. A gas station loomed briefly, its lights dark, shuttered against the weather. A trucker had pulled in beneath the awning, huddled in the cab for safety. He glanced up as Thomas's pickup roared past, headlights flashing through the snow. The fleeting moment painted a picture of lives intersecting briefly before vanishing back into the storm. Emily whispered prayers under her breath, fragments of verses she half remembered from her mother's bedside. Each word was a plea for survival, for mercy. Bruno, ever watchful, lifted his head occasionally to sniff the air, then lowered it again, as if guarding Ryan with silent devotion. At one point, the truck slowed as a fallen branch blocked the road. Thomas cursed under his breath, pulling to a stop. He jumped out, snow stinging his face, and heaved the branch aside with straining muscles. By the time he climbed back in, his beard was frosted and his breath came in clouds. He glanced at Emily, who held Bruno close like a shield. For a moment, the sight nearly broke him, the weight of responsibility, of loss endured and still feared. But he pressed on, because he had to. The hospital lights finally shimmered in the distance, a faint glow against the storm's fury. Thomas felt a surge of relief, tempered by the final test of navigating the icy lot. He skidded to a halt under the emergency bay, brakes squealing. The doors burst open, and a nurse hurried out, her figure sturdy in a padded coat, face lined with years of service. Nurse Linda Marsh, mid-50s, was known in town for her brusque efficiency and a heart that often outweighed her sharp tone. She had weathered decades in emergency care, her short gray hair cropped neatly, her eyes bright and unwavering even in crisis. She strode forward, barking orders to the staff following behind her. "What do we have?" she demanded, voice carrying over the storm. "Officer, car crash," Thomas called, lifting Ryan carefully. "Head trauma, maybe ribs." Linda's expression hardened with practiced calm. "Get him inside, room 2. Move." Within moments, Ryan was whisked away, swallowed by white walls and fluorescent lights. Thomas stood in the doorway, chest heaving, as Emily clutched Bruno's leash. Her face was pale, but her eyes shone with the fragile hope of a child who had done her part. Bruno shook the snow from his coat, then sat solidly at her side, eyes fixed on the doors that had taken Ryan. He seemed unwilling to rest until the man inside was safe. Thomas laid a hand on Emily's shoulder, his voice softer now. "We did what we could. The rest is up to them." Emily leaned into Bruno, whispering, "Please, don't let him die." And as the snow continued to fall outside, sealing the world in white silence, the girl, her father, and the dog waited together, hearts bound by the fragile thread of hope. The storm had eased by the time Thomas steered the old pickup back along the winding highway that skirted the forest ridges. The hospital lights were now only a distant glow behind them, swallowed by drifting snow and darkness. Emily leaned against Bruno in the back seat, her cheek pressed against his warm fur, exhaustion pulling at her eyelids. Yet the girl's thoughts refused to rest. They spun with fragments of worry about the officer they had left behind. Thomas drove with his usual steady hands, though his eyes betrayed fatigue. The last few hours had demanded everything of him: strength to carry an injured man, courage to reassure his daughter, and the calm of a soldier when chaos threatened. He tried not to dwell on memories of another night years ago, when he had driven through deserts in a convoy under fire, but they slipped in anyway, sharp and unwelcome. He exhaled, keeping his focus on the road because Emily needed him here, now. Bruno stirred suddenly, stirred. His ears pricked, his body stiffened, and a low growl rumbled from his chest. Emily sat up straighter. "What is it, boy?" she whispered. The dog pawed at the window, gaze fixed on the slope of the mountain road where snow gathered in heaps against the guardrail. Thomas slowed the truck. "Hang on." He pulled to the shoulder, engine idling. Bruno whined, then leapt down the moment the door cracked open, his paws sinking into the powdery snow. Emily hurried after him, clutching her scarf against the cold. Thomas followed more cautiously, flashlight in hand. Bruno's nose worked furiously, guiding him to a patch of disturbed snow near the embankment. He dug quickly, powerful paws scattering white clumps aside. Emily crouched beside him, her breath rising in pale bursts, until something metallic caught the beam of Thomas's light. A dented toolbox lay half-buried, its lid ajar. Thomas knelt, brushing snow away. He flipped the box open. Inside lay a collection of wrenches, pliers, and a brake bleeder kit. One of the larger tools was smeared with dark grease, and when Thomas rubbed it between his fingers, he recognized the gritty residue instantly brake dust mixed with oil. His chest tightened. "This wasn't left here by accident." Emily's eyes widened. "Daddy, you think this has something to do with Officer Ryan's crash?" Before Thomas could answer, headlights swept across them. A semi-truck rumbled down the road, chains clattering on its tires. The driver slowed as he passed, curiosity piqued by the sight of a man, a child, and a German shepherd huddled over a toolbox in the snow. He pulled over a few yards ahead, air brakes hissing. The cab door swung open and down climbed Jack Hanley, a trucker in his 40s with a thick build, ruddy cheeks, and a neatly trimmed beard peppered with gray. He wore a padded flannel jacket and a knit cap pulled low. Jack was known among the drivers who passed through Whispering Pines for his easy laugh and generous habit of sharing coffee with stranded motorists. But tonight, his brow furrowed with concern as he approached. "Everything all right here?" Thomas rose, nodding and greeting. "We're fine. Just found something." He gestured to the toolbox. Jack crouched, squinting at the tools. His gaze sharpened. "That's a brake bleeder. Looks fresh, too. Been on the road long enough to know what kind of job that's for." Emily clutched Bruno's collar, her voice hushed. "We think someone hurt the officer." Jack's jaw set grimly. He studied the family, then the dog, who stood tall and alert. "That's serious. Folks in town will want to hear about it. News like this spreads fast." He straightened, giving Thomas a meaningful look. "Better keep that safe. Could be the proof you need." Thomas closed the box, tucking it under his arm. He didn't say the thoughts that thundered through his head, that this confirmed what his instincts had whispered from the moment he saw the mangled cruiser. This wasn't an accident. Someone had meant for Ryan Miller not to survive. Jack clapped Thomas on the shoulder. "Good thing you've got sharp eyes and a sharper dog. That shepherd of yours might have just saved more than one life tonight." He offered a brief smile before heading back to his truck. The engine growled, tires biting into snow as the rig pulled away, disappearing into the dark curve of the highway. Emily looked at her father, uncertainty clouding her face. "What happens now?" Thomas glanced at Bruno, who stood proudly with snow dusting his muzzle. "Now we do what's right. We bring this to the people who can make sense of it." They returned to the truck. Emily settled back against Bruno, who lay with his head in her lap, eyes half closed but ears still twitching at every sound. She stroked his fur absently, comforted by his solid presence. Thomas placed the toolbox carefully on the floor by his feet, one hand tightening on the wheel as he drove them homeward. The town of Whispering Pines lay quiet under its blanket of snow, unaware of the discovery that would soon ripple through its streets. But Emily knew. As she drifted toward sleep with Bruno's warmth against her, she whispered softly, "You're a hero, boy." And in her heart, she believed the dog had uncovered something far bigger than any of them could yet understand. The hospital in Whispering Pines was not large, but its walls carried the weight of countless emergencies weathered through long winters. Snow still clung to the windows, muting the sounds of the storm outside. Inside, the corridors glowed under fluorescent lights, the faint hum of machines blending with the distant beeps of monitors. Room 12A smelled of antiseptic and the faint trace of coffee drifting from the nurse's station. Officer Ryan Miller lay propped against thin white pillows, his forehead bandaged, one arm secured in a sling. His dark hair was still matted where blood had dried, and the bruises along his ribs made every breath an effort. At 32, Ryan had the kind of build shaped by years of training broad shoulders, lean muscle, but now slackened by pain. His eyes, normally a clear steel blue, flickered open slowly, heavy with the haze of medication and the struggle of returning to consciousness. Nurse Linda Marsh, the seasoned nurse who had taken charge when he was first brought in, entered the room with a clipboard. Her short gray hair was tucked neatly behind her ears, and her sharp eyes softened only when she saw Ryan blinking awake. "Well," she said, her voice brisk yet not unkind, "seems the stubborn ones always find their way back." She adjusted the IV line with the confidence of someone who had been doing this work for decades. Ryan groaned, shifting slightly. "Where?" "You're at Whispering Pines General," Linda answered. "Alive, which is more than I expected when they dragged you in. You've got a concussion, bruised ribs, nothing you can't recover from, but you're going to be sore for a while." Ryan's gaze flickered to the door as it opened again. Thomas entered, his broad frame still dusted with snow, Emily trailing behind him with Bruno at her side. Emily carried something small in her mittened hand, clutching it tightly as though it were a secret. Bruno padded forward, his sable coat glistening under the hospital lights, ears twitching as he sniffed the unfamiliar air. Ryan tried to sit up straighter, wincing. Thomas stepped forward. "Don't push it. You've been through enough tonight." Ryan's lips curved faintly. "You're the one who pulled me out." His voice was rough, but the gratitude in it was unmistakable. Thomas shook his head. "It was my daughter and her dog who found you first. Bruno wouldn't let her leave you there." Ryan's gaze shifted to Emily. The girl stood hesitantly, her hazel eyes bright but wary. She held out the small object she had been carrying, a frayed keychain, its fabric charm shaped like a faded star. "This was my mom's," she whispered. "She used to say it kept people safe. I want you to have it." Ryan blinked, taken aback. He reached for it slowly, his fingers brushing hers as he accepted the charm. For a moment, his expression softened, the hard lines of pain easing. "Thank you, Emily. That means more than I can say." Bruno let out a low whine, pressing his head gently against the bed. Ryan's hand drifted to the dog's fur, scratching behind the bent ear. "And you, big guy? I owe you." Thomas cleared his throat, his tone more serious now. "Ryan, there's something you need to know. On the way back from the hospital, Bruno found this." He lifted the dented toolbox they had retrieved, setting it on the side table. Ryan's eyes sharpened instantly. He forced himself more upright despite the pain. "What's inside?" Thomas flipped it open, revealing the greasy wrenches and brake bleeder kit. The smell of oil still clung faintly. Ryan's jaw tightened. His mind replayed the moment his patrol car careened out of control, the brakes giving way on the mountain road. "That's it," he muttered. "That's how they did it." His voice gained strength, fueled by certainty. The brakes weren't failing from wear. Someone tampered with them. They wanted me dead. Emily gasped softly, her small hand clutching Bruno's collar. "But why?" Ryan's gaze turned toward the window, where snowflakes drifted like ghosts in the night. "Because I've been digging where I wasn't supposed to. I've been investigating a smuggling ring running goods through this town. I had enough leads to make someone nervous." His eyes flicked back to the toolbox. "And nervous men get desperate." Thomas folded his arms, his marine steadiness unshaken. "So it wasn't just an accident. Someone tried to finish you." Ryan nodded grimly. "And if Bruno hadn't found me, they would have succeeded." The room fell quiet, the hum of machines filling the silence. Emily shifted closer to Bruno, hugging him tightly. She thought of her mother again, how helpless she had felt then, and how different it felt now, having done something that had made a difference. Nurse Linda stepped forward, her gaze stern. "You need rest, officer. This talk of smugglers can wait until you can walk without wobbling." Ryan managed a faint smile, though his eyes burned with resolve. "Rest, yes, but not silence. Whoever did this will try again if we don't stop them." Thomas exchanged a glance with Emily, then with Bruno, whose steady presence filled the room with quiet determination. The truth was no longer hidden. The broken patrol car was not fate, but sabotage. And because of a girl, her father, and a faithful dog, the survivor had lived to tell his story. The morning in Whispering Pines dawned brittle and white, sunlight struggling through heavy clouds. The town looked peaceful under its quilt of snow, but Ryan Miller knew peace was an illusion. He sat stiffly in the passenger seat of Thomas Carter's old pickup, his side still aching from broken ribs, while Thomas guided the truck along the winding road that led back to the crash site. Bruno sat in the bed of the truck, his breath puffing like smoke in the cold air, ears pricked forward in anticipation. Emily had begged to come, but Thomas insisted she stay behind. She sulked at first, then agreed when Ryan promised she would have an important role later, helping him put together the puzzle of notes and reports he had begun compiling. The girl had brightened instantly, her hazel eyes glowing with purpose. Bruno, though, had whined when she shut the door behind her, as if unhappy to leave his young companion behind. The forest was hushed when they arrived. The shattered cruiser had already been towed away, leaving only scorched tracks in the snow and shards of glass glinting in the pale light. Thomas cut the engine. Ryan gritted his teeth against the cold and climbed out, his boots sinking into the powder. Bruno leapt down beside him, nose already pressed to the ground, tail stiff with concentration. Thomas scanned the site with the eyes of a man who had once walked battlefields. "Looks ordinary enough now," he muttered. "Not to him," Ryan replied, watching Bruno. "A dog sees what we don't." Bruno trotted to the edge of the embankment where the patrol car had crashed. His nose worked furiously, tracing invisible trails. Then he stopped abruptly, ears erect, paw pressing into a patch of blackened snow. Thomas knelt, brushing away the frost. There, faint but clear, was a stain of oil, smeared in a trail that led back toward the road. "Brake fluid," Ryan murmured, crouching beside him. "They bled the lines. Bruno's just proved it." Bruno whined, circling and following the scent up toward the roadside guardrail. He barked once, sharply, and pawed at a spot where the snow had been disturbed. Ryan's eyes narrowed. "They worked right here. Sabotaged the car before it went over." Thomas looked grim. "So whoever it was knew exactly where you'd be parked." Ryan straightened slowly, his breath puffing in the cold. "Kyle Morton," he said finally, his voice flat with certainty. Morton was a man who had been in Ryan's reports for months. A businessman in his 40s, tall, broad-shouldered, with slicked-back hair that gleamed like polished steel. He wore expensive suits, spoke in polite tones, and donated generously to local charities. But beneath the polish, Ryan had found whispers. Morton's trucking company being used to move contraband, shipments that never appeared on manifests, workers who were paid to stay silent. Morton carried himself like a pillar of the community, but Ryan had learned to look past masks. Thomas spat into the snow. "I've seen men like him before, the kind who hide behind good manners while someone else gets their hands dirty." Ryan nodded grimly. "And now he's desperate. My investigation was closing in. He couldn't risk exposure." Bruno barked again, his breath clouding in the frosty air. He seemed restless, as if aware of the weight of what he had uncovered. Thomas ruffled the dog's head. "Good work, boy. You're the best detective out here." They gathered what they could, photographs of the stains, impressions in the snow, the pattern of disturbance near the guardrail. It wasn't much, but combined with the toolbox Bruno had unearthed earlier, it was enough to paint a picture. Someone had deliberately tampered with the brakes, and Morton had motive written all over him. Back at the Carter home, Emily sat cross-legged on the rug in front of the fireplace, papers spread around her like fallen leaves. She was methodical in her own way, aligning Ryan's handwritten notes, sorting photographs, and placing receipts into neat stacks. Her brow furrowed in concentration, the tip of her tongue peeking out as she worked. She wanted to be useful, wanted to prove she could help. When the men returned, she looked up eagerly. "Did you find more?" Ryan eased into a chair with a groan, sliding the new photographs across the table. "Bruno did," he said warmly, giving the dog a grateful glance. "He found proof the car was sabotaged." Emily smiled proudly, hugging Bruno tightly. "I knew you would." The dog settled by the door, watchful. Whenever footsteps echoed faintly outside, a neighbor passing, the crunch of snow on the sidewalk, Bruno's ears flicked, his body tensing until the sound faded. His vigilance didn't escape Thomas's notice. "He doesn't trust what's out there," he said quietly. "Can't say I blame him." Emily returned to her work, carefully placing the newest evidence in order. She held up a photograph of the oil stain and asked softly, "Does this mean the bad men will be caught?" Ryan's expression hardened. "It means we know who we're after. Kyle Morton thinks he can buy respectability, but he can't buy his way out of this, not anymore." Bruno shifted closer to Emily, his amber eyes gleaming in the firelight. The warmth of the hearth spread across the room, but the truth was chilling. The crash had been no accident, and the enemy they faced was not a nameless shadow. He had a face, a business, and the arrogance of a man who believed he was untouchable. But thanks to the girl, her father, and the loyal shepherd who refused to stop searching, Morton's carefully hidden trail was beginning to unravel. The sun dipped behind the pines earlier than usual, casting long shadows across whispering pines as evening settled in with a hush. Snow still lined the sidewalks in soft heaps, and chimney smoke curled lazily into the slate-blue sky. In a small rental house at the edge of town, one borrowed from a retired state trooper friend while he recovered Ryan Miller stood at a stove in borrowed sweatpants and a long-sleeved Henley shirt, stirring a pot of chili. Though he was still healing, the color had returned to his face, and the tired creases near his eyes had softened in the warmth of familiarity. Cooking wasn't his specialty, but he wanted to say thank you in the best way he could. "Smells like someone's trying to outcook my dad," Emily teased as she stepped into the kitchen, cheeks flushed from the cold outside. She wore a red plaid flannel shirt over her sweater, 2 sizes too big, sleeves rolled up. Bruno trailed behind her, tail swaying gently, his thick sable coat brushed and slightly damp from melted snow. Thomas entered last, his large frame filling the doorway. He had cleaned up since the afternoon, trading his grease-streaked jacket for a simple navy button-down and jeans. He looked every bit the former Marine tonight, quiet, alert, carrying unspoken weight beneath a calm exterior. Ryan chuckled. "I'm not saying it'll be perfect, but it's hot and edible." Emily beamed and took a seat at the small wooden dining table where mismatched plates and silverware had been set with more care than symmetry. A few candles flickered in glass jars, giving the whole room a soft, amber glow. Bruno sat near the table but alert, watching the door with quiet purpose. The house felt like it was holding its breath, simple, warm, almost like a place where nothing bad could reach. Dinner began with laughter. Ryan shared a story about his academy days, earning a chuckle from Thomas and wide-eyed wonder from Emily. The girl passed Bruno scraps under the table while pretending she wasn't, and Bruno accepted them gently, his tail thumping against the hardwood floor. For a moment, the world outside disappeared. But it didn't stay gone. There was a sound, not loud, just a faint creak of floorboards beyond the hallway barely noticeable beneath the hum of conversation. Bruno's head snapped up. His ears pricked and his body stiffened. Emily felt it first. A sudden tension in the room. Bruno's growl, low and warning, filled the silence like a rumble of distant thunder. Thomas stood, his posture instinctively shifting, Marine mode. Ryan's hand reached under the table, fingers brushing the holster strapped around his ribs. He'd gotten approval to carry again just days ago, and now he was thankful for it. The front door creaked. A shadow crossed the hallway. Then 2 men stepped into view. The first was tall, wiry, wearing a black coat slick with melting snow. His face was narrow, eyes dark and predatory, and a thin scar ran from the corner of his lip to his chin. The second man, heavier, carried a silenced pistol loosely at his side, his expression unreadable beneath a wool beanie. Ryan's voice was cold and even. "You're not here for dinner, I take it." The scarred man smiled without humor. "Mr. Morton sends his regards. You should have stayed in that ditch, officer." Bruno snarled, his muscles taut. The dog stood between Emily and the intruders now, no longer calm, but coiled to strike. Thomas moved to Emily, pulling her behind him. "Leave. Now. This isn't going to go how you think." Scarface lifted the pistol too late. Bruno lunged. The dog moved like lightning, jaws clamping onto the arm of the second man just as the gun fired too high, hitting the ceiling with a dull thump. Wood splinters rained down. The heavier man screamed, staggering back as Bruno dragged him down with brutal efficiency. Ryan rose fast, ducking behind the kitchen counter as Scarface turned toward the chaos. A single shot from Ryan's pistol cracked through the air. The bullet struck the doorframe as Scarface dove for cover. "Emily, down!" Thomas barked. She dropped to the floor, heart pounding, hands over her ears, but her eyes never left Bruno. The dog fought with focused fury, teeth sunk into the man's forearm, shaking until the gun clattered from his grip. Sirens wailed in the distance. Ryan fired again, grazing Scarface's shoulder as he tried to escape through the back. The man stumbled, cursing, and vanished into the night. Bruno held the injured thug down until Thomas pinned him and kicked the fallen weapon across the floor. Moments later, the front door burst open and the local law enforcement stormed in, weapons drawn. Deputy Claire Hammond led the group early 30s, tall and no-nonsense, her long blonde hair tied in a braid, eyes sharp behind square glasses. She had grown up in Whispering Pines and didn't tolerate violence on her watch. "Clear!" she shouted as her team spread out. Thomas raised his hands. "He's secure. Other one went out back." Bruno stepped off the attacker and returned to Emily's side, chest heaving, muzzle smeared with blood. Ryan stood, lowering his pistol, and nodded grimly at Claire. "Morton sent them. You need to put him on watch, now." Claire nodded, already issuing orders into her radio. Paramedics followed, dragging the bleeding man out in cuffs while officers pursued the one who fled. The house was a mess: shattered dishes, overturned chairs, a bullet lodged in the ceiling beam, but the family inside was alive. Emily clung to Bruno, tears on her cheeks, not of fear, but pride. Ryan crouched beside her, wincing. "Your dog just saved us all." She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I knew he would." The late winter sun cast a golden glow over Whispering Pines, the kind that seemed to soften even the harshest of memories. Snow still clung to the gutters of the town hall, but flowers, early crocuses, brave against the cold, had begun to bloom along the walkways, as if the earth itself was awakening from a long-held breath. Inside the modest community center, folding chairs were set up in neat rows, streamers of blue and gold looped between wooden beams. A banner hung proudly at the front. "Whispering Pines honors its heroes." Ryan stood near the podium, the weight of the past few weeks finally beginning to lift. He wore his freshly pressed dark navy police uniform again, the badge shone beneath the warm light, newly reinstated and polished like a medal. He looked stronger, the bandages long gone, but there remained a quiet reverence in his posture, a humility born from survival. Emily sat between Thomas and an elderly woman in a wide-brimmed hat and burgundy wool coat, Mrs. Jenkins, the town's most infamous knitter and one of the oldest residents of Whispering Pines. Short and plump, her wrinkled hands were always moving, always creating. She had a sharp tongue for gossip, but a heart that melted for children and dogs alike. Bruno lay at Emily's feet, regal and calm, a red and black plaid bandana tied loosely around his neck. His sable coat had been brushed to a sheen, though a faint scar beneath his ear remained visible. He watched the crowd with intelligent eyes, occasionally thumping his tail whenever Emily whispered to him. Thomas wore a charcoal sport coat, a rare sight. His broad shoulders seemed a little stiffer under formal fabric, but there was no mistaking the pride in his gaze as he looked over the small gathering. Sheriff Mallory Hart took the podium, her voice calm and commanding as ever. She was in her early 50s, tall and striking, with salt-and-pepper hair tied in a tight bun. Her uniform was immaculate, her gaze sharp yet warm when it landed on the trio in the front row. "Today," she began, "we recognize courage in its many forms, not just in uniforms or titles, but in action, in heart, in instinct." Applause rippled through the crowd. She continued, detailing the events of the previous weeks with care. How an investigation into Morton's network led to his arrest after a failed hit on Officer Miller. How Ryan had risked his life protecting a child he barely knew. How Thomas, a veteran still healing from past battles, had stood his ground once more. And how a 10-year-old German Shepherd had defied age and injury to defend them all. "Bruno," she said, turning slightly to gesture toward the dog, "may not wear a badge, but he has earned one." Gasps and delighted murmurs swept through the room. Emily clapped, her eyes already glistening. Deputy Claire Hammond stepped forward, carrying a small wooden plaque and a shiny canine service medallion attached to a velvet ribbon. She bent down, gently placing it around Bruno's neck. The plaque read, "Bruno, Guardian of Whispering Pines." The applause that followed was thunderous. Emily couldn't hold back her tears any longer. She threw her arms around Bruno, who responded by licking her cheek with a soft, muffled grunt. The room erupted in gentle laughter. Then came Thomas's recognition. Sheriff Hart handed him a folded citation. "For bravery and civilian assistance in active threat conditions, we award Thomas Ross the Community Valor Commendation." He accepted it with a short nod and a tight smile, eyes briefly locking with Ryan's in mutual understanding. It wasn't about medals for either of them, but acknowledgement mattered. Emily, too, was called up. Sheriff Hart knelt to her level, holding a small silver star charm on a blue ribbon. to Miss Emily Ross, whose bravery under fire and bond with the remarkable canine reminded us all of the power of love and trust. You are, from this day on, officially, our little Lionheart. Emily stood, trembling with pride, the charm around her neck catching the light. She looked to Bruno, whispered, "We did it." From the back, Mrs. Jenkins waddled forward with a brown paper package. Her cheeks flushed with effort. She held it out to Emily. "For your boy," she said, voice cracking. "I stayed up all night making it." Emily opened it slowly. Inside was a deep navy blue knit scarf, with a small bone pattern stitched along the ends. Bruno sat tall as Emily wrapped it gently around his neck, right below the medallion. Mrs. Jenkins sniffed and patted the dog. "You're a hero, old man, the real kind. Whispering Pines hasn't had one like you in decades." The rest of the afternoon melted into warm chatter and gentle music played by a local fiddle duo. Cookies were passed. Coffee poured. Ryan stood with Thomas by the punch table, watching Emily play near the dais with some of the neighborhood kids. Bruno lay beside her, paws crossed, scarf fluttering slightly as he raised his head to scan the crowd. Ryan turned to Thomas. "You think he knows what all this is about?" Thomas chuckled, arms crossed. "He knows, not the ceremony, but that he's loved, that he belongs." Ryan nodded, quiet for a long moment. "I never thought a dog would be the one to bring everything back together." "He didn't just bring it together," Thomas said, eyes distant. "He saved it." The music drifted into a soft lullaby, and through the windows, snow began to fall again, gentle and slow, but this time no one felt the cold. Sometimes God doesn't send angels with wings. He sends them with paws, scars, and a silent loyalty that speaks louder than words. Bruno wasn't just a dog. He was a miracle wrapped in fur, a reminder that even those discarded by the world still carry purpose in God's eyes. This story isn't just about courage. It's about redemption, second chances, and the quiet ways the Lord works through our darkest nights. Whether it's a child's hug, a neighbor's kindness, or an old dog's bark at the right moment. Miracles are still around us, if we choose to see them. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes in hope. Type Amen in the comments. If you believe that every soul, man, child, or animal, is loved by God and never forgotten. Subscribe for more stories that remind us of faith, family, and the unseen grace that guides our lives. And may God bless everyone watching this right now with peace, protection, and love.